Eugene couldn't stop marveling at his native village through the bus window. Even from a distance, it was clear how much everything had changed, and quite drastically at that. As the village drew nearer, the differences became even more pronounced. He no longer saw weeds and well-tended gardens instead of dirt roads. There was asphalt everywhere, and every house boasted siding, a repaired roof, and external cleanliness. All these changes had occurred in just 2 years. If he didn't know where he was going, he could easily have mistaken his native village for a small European town. Getting off at a small stop, Eugene, still amazed, headed towards his parents' house. He hadn't seen them since he left to work in the far north. As soon as the bus, turning around, hurried away, a smiling woman in a clean blue dress approached the young man and inquired, "Good day. Are you here to see someone?" "Good day. Yes, I am. To my parents," the young man answered, surprised by the question. "Ah, so you must be Eugene." "Exactly. They are expecting you today," the woman said, still smiling, and hurried away as unexpectedly as she appeared. A little bewildered, the young man stood at the stop for about a minute, but shrugged in puzzlement and headed to his parents' house. Upon arrival, he didn't recognize them at first. They looked noticeably younger and smiled. Instead of the usual gray and shapeless attire, his mother now wore a blue dress, and his father even preferred to wear a strict black suit and a white shirt at home. The parents, after hugging their son, invited him into the house, immediately seating him at the table. Eugene glanced at the dishes and was surprised to notice the absence of meat. "We don't eat it anymore, only vegetables and fish," his mother said with a smile, and looking at her husband added, "And we don't drink either. Nobody drinks in the village anymore." This surprised Eugene the most. If before his mother didn't particularly enjoy drinking, his father was a real alcoholic, and generally everyone in their village drank, from small to large. Offering some food from the road, Antonina stopped her son when he wanted to start eating. "First we need to pray," the woman said quietly, and, closing her eyes, began to recite some strange mantras. They seemed to be in Russian, but the words were distorted, and their meaning was unclear. After the word Amen, Eugene wanted, as in church, to cross himself, but his mother gently stopped his hand, explaining that it's not customary for them. Modern and advanced people live here, and all these rituals are long outdated. During lunch, his mother joyfully told her son that they no longer keep any animals except goats, and often consume their milk. Nobody drinks anymore in the village, and everyone works. More and more young people are coming to the village, and they like it here. They also started living in harmony with themselves and nature. And generally, everything has changed drastically since he came. When Eugene asked, "Who is he?" his mother just smiled mysteriously and quietly repeated, "He, the bringer of truth." Finishing the meal, the young man went out into the yard and lit up. Looking at the clean houses and well-tended gardens, he marveled at the drastic changes. Eugene expected to see his mother dissatisfied and tired as usual, and his aggressive and drunk father, who would teach him about life. But everything was different here. They showed an atypical care and politeness and didn't even curse. Perhaps my parents joined some sect or simply went crazy. They've turned the whole village upside down, but for the better, the young man decided, looking around. He was pulled out of his thoughts by a slight nudge in his leg. Eugene lowered his gaze and saw a snowy white goat. The animal's fur was neatly groomed, and around its neck was tied a blue ribbon with a small copper bell. The well-groomed animal rubbed its horns against the young man's leg, and a characteristic, barely audible jingle sounded. Eugene didn't like it, and he stepped a bit to the right. The stubborn goat approached him again and repeated the action, after which the young man, without much thought, weakly pushed it away, and immediately dropped his almost smoked cigarette, startled by the unexpectedness of it. "Don't you dare!" His mother's soft voice instantly filled with anger. When Eugene turned to Antonina, for a fraction of a second, he noticed her face distorted with rage, but the woman immediately smiled as usual and said much quieter, "Eugene, don't hurt her children. "You simply don't like violence here." The young man just nodded, and saying this, wanted to take a walk around the village, left the yard. Everything was somehow very strange and extremely alarming. Leaving the yard, he walked aimlessly, just strolling. And then he was called from behind. "Zhenya, hey, give me a lift." A cheerful male voice was full of liveliness and agility. The young man turned sharply and, mechanically greeting with a brief nod of his head, at first didn't recognize the lean jogging athlete as his uncle Vasya, nicknamed Throat, the town drunk. The new tracksuit significantly differed from the torn ones that the local boozer used to wear. The man, missing Eugene as he passed by without stopping, exclaimed, "Glad you're back home. It's the right choice. May he be with you." And the man, without slowing down, disappeared around the corner of the next street. Surprised, Eugene watched the former alcoholic. Standing like that for about 10 seconds, the young man continued his walk. To his next surprise, the guy didn't see a single dog, but in every yard, there was at least one goat grazing. All of them were exclusively white, with a blue ribbon tied around their necks, and the same small copper bell. Aimlessly wandering, Eugene reached the gates of the old village church and stopped. It turned out to be abandoned. Once the church was popular among all the villagers, and on church holidays, huge crowds of people would always gather there. Now it was an abandoned, empty building with a collapsed dome. Its roof had caved in. The torn doors lay nearby, and the broken windows sadly looked at the uninvited guest. The sight of the old church was disheartening. It wasn't just abandoned, it was intentionally torn apart and left to die in such a state. And then for some unknown reason, Eugene was seized by an icy shiver. He felt sad, and even a little scared. Everything felt somehow unnatural and false in all these wonderful changes. He decided that he would spend the night at his parents' house today and leave back to the city tomorrow. And from there, to his shift. And, of course, he wouldn't tell his parents about his plans. In the evening, they had dinner together, not forgetting about the strange prayer. Again, his mother talked at length about how well they were living now. When the son asked about what happened to the village church, Antonina's face instantly changed. Her features became stern and cold. After a few seconds of silence, the woman spoke dryly. "When he came, he immediately opened our eyes to this so-called faith. What kind of God is that if he only demands suffering and obedience? We've rejected this relic of the past. We chose freedom and happiness. And I hope, son, you'll do the same. You'll join us, won't you?" Eugene remained silent in response. The pause stretched for a long decade of seconds. And then the young man stood up abruptly and, citing that he was very tired and wanted to sleep, left the room. The faces of his parents stretched again into a broad and rehearsed smile, and they said in unison, "Good night. May he be with you." Zhenya woke up to a barely audible rustling, and when he tried to open his eyes, they were immediately covered and pressed down into the bed. Several pairs of hands restrained his movements, and a bag was quickly placed over his head. He was lifted and carried somewhere. Eugene screamed in fear. He tried to break free, but they held him firmly. And a strange male voice loudly said, "You can scream all you want. No one will help you anyway." And then a familiar voice reached his ears, freezing his heart with a sticky, icy wave of horror. His own mother spoke. "Be careful with him. He needs to stay alive." They carried him for a long time, and then gently laid him on the ground and ordered him to kneel. By that time, his hands were already tied, and he resembled a prisoner of war. The guy obediently did as he was told. With a deft movement, they removed the bag from his head, and at the sight, Eugene lost his ability to speak. He knelt in the middle of a freshly plowed field, surrounded by dozens of naked people with blood-smeared faces. The age varied greatly. All the villagers had gathered here, from teenagers to frail old men. The young man looked at the only man dressed in a white robe, but even he, having discarded his clothes, scooped blood from a huge wooden tub, reverently applied it to his face, and, raising his hands to the night sky, shouted loudly, "Hallowed be thy name!" From the naked crowd emerged his own mother. Like everyone else, Antonina was naked, and her face was smeared with blood. She approached her son and, placing her hand on his shoulder, smiled and said, "Son, now you'll be with us too. Don't worry. Everything will be fine. Soon he will come, and you will partake." After these words, the woman returned to the mad crowd, and everyone began to sing some song, or rather a melody. The hellish cacophony was a chaotic blend of ululations, whistles, screams, and some chants. It seemed as if people had gone mad in an instant and resembled more deranged Amazonian natives than representatives of civilized society. When Genya's eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, he could make out a tall wooden throne, and before it, a huge oak table. The wild song gained momentum, and soon calls to him could be heard in the crowd. The frenzied mass called out to the one they worshipped, and he came. Something emerged from the forest amidst joyful cries, and it was not human. It was a tall, muscular chimera, about 2 meters tall, with the body of an anthropomorphic goat, slowly and confidently walking on its hind hooves. From the neck to the waist, including the arms, it was a regular man with well-defined muscles. But below that were goat hooves covered in black fur. The goat-headed creature was crowned with antler-like deer horns, and its eyes with vertical pupils glowed like crimson rubies. And a long, bald tail ending in thick black fur writhed like a snake from side to side. The creature sat on the throne and raised its hand, showing 2 fingers. The fanatics cheered joyfully, some falling to their knees before the creature. But the spectacle didn't last long. Soon the chimera, closing its eyes, nodded in agreement, and a deafening cry pierced the night. From the crowd, they dragged a frightened and beaten man by the arms. He was barely dressed, wearing only undergarments. He tried to break free again, but one of the occultists punched him hard in the stomach, and, without letting him catch his breath, forcibly lifted him and dragged him toward the table. Along the way, he struck the prisoner a couple more times, this time in the face, and when the captive was almost unconscious, they hoisted him onto the oak table and fastened his hands and feet to this infernal altar. The unfortunate man was crucified in the manner of the St. Andrew's cross. From the subdued crowd emerged a gray-haired, long-bearded old man, like everyone else, naked and blood-smeared. He bowed low to the creature on the throne and spoke loudly. "And it is said in the Bible, 'Eat my flesh and drink my blood, for this is holy, and flesh is life.'" The cultists repeated in unison, "Flesh is life." The old man became more fervent, "And I will give my life for my brothers and sisters." At this moment, a strong man approached the beaten and crucified captive with a long knife in his hand. "For this is my sacrifice, and my flesh is your life." After these words, the cultist, wielding the knife, plunged it into the crucified man, and with one swift motion slit his abdomen from the diaphragm to the groin. The involuntary victim screamed in pain, but soon the cry ceased. The man convulsed and choked on his own blood. A hand gently rested on Genya's shoulder, making him flinch. It was his mother. She smiled and offered him a cup with something, saying softly, "Drink, son. It will make you feel better." Then added ambiguously, "To avoid being the sacrifice, you need to drink this." The frightened boy took the vessel with his bound and trembling hands and greedily sipped the contents, spilling most of it on the ground. The drink turned out to be ordinary goat's milk, but with a strange bitterness. As soon as Genya finished it, his head immediately began to spin, and then everything was like in a fog. Dozens of naked people approached the altar and, drinking human blood straight from the split abdomen, took a small piece of flesh from the hands of the creature. A gray-haired priest stood nearby, cutting small pieces of human flesh with a long knife and handing them to the creature. Soon the cultists started dancing in a frenzy, resembling a wild and frenzied orgy. Naked sectarians convulsively danced, howling and shouting loudly. And soon Genya's vision blurred, and he lost consciousness. The young man woke up early in the morning, thinking it was a terrible dream, and tried to get out of bed, only to discover that his right hand was bound with chains. He was tied to the bed. At that moment, his mother entered the room with a tray in her hands. She no longer had blood on her face, and her body was covered in a blue, clean dress. She sat on the bed and spoke softly. Jen, what you saw yesterday was a usual ritual. We perform it when he comes to inspect a new candidate. You've been introduced to him, and I'm pleased to tell you that you fit our community." She handed her son a glass of milk. The young man silently watched, hesitating to accept the drink. Then Antonina smiled even more, hissing like a snake. "Son, drink this milk. You don't want to be the one lying on the table, do you? Drink, my son. Drink." Reluctantly and fearfully, Zhenya took the glass with his free left hand and sipped the goat's milk. Soon, he felt dizzy again. They sat in the kitchen. Antonina, smiling horribly, patted her son's head like a mother, and he, leaning on his mother's shoulder, dazed, indifferently stared at the floor. Drool slowly dripped from his slightly open mouth, and the quiet, more hissing voice of the woman whispered, "And when you accept his gift, we'll release you back into the city, and there you'll find a bride suitable for us. After all, the community must grow,